use cases of Web3 through DePIN. This episode of the DePIN Hub podcast is brought to you by Nodi, the new Node as a Service product by DePIN Hub. We've seen that 2025 is the opportunities of the node sales. There's a lot of projects with great opportunities, but to run a node is quite complicated. You need to understand Linux, technical terminology, servers, virtual servers, VPNs, VPS, a lot of complexities that you don't want to have to handle. And even if you do, you want to be able to sleep at night knowing that other people are taking care of that for you, right? Leave this work for the nerds. We guarantee that you're going to have the best service possible and all your nodes are going to be generating passive income for you every day without you having to do any work. So go to depinhub.io/nodes. And that page, you're going to know everything that's happening in our Node as a Service product. And make sure to subscribe to the newsletter because there you're going to know everything that's happening, all the promotions, all the sales, all the great opportunities to make 2025 a great year for us all. Hello everyone, Daniel from DePIN Hub here. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with David Garrett, the CEO and co-founder of dVIN Labs. dVIN Labs is revolutionizing the wine industry by merging blockchain technology with luxury and investment grade wine. Their mission is to tokenize the 1 trillion wine asset class, creating transparency, security, and accessibility for wine enthusiasts and producers alike. And let's start by you talking about yourself, your background, and your role at dVIN Labs.
Sure. Thanks. Well, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for invite. It's great to be here. I think we've talked a bunch of times. It's really nice to kind of come back with an update of where we are and what we've been up to. It's been a busy 6 months, I think, since or maybe 8 months since we saw you in Singapore. So yeah, my name's Dave Garrett. I'm the co-founder and CEO of dVIN Labs. My background was initially in technology. I was a tech founder in my early 20s. Sold the company when I was 28. And then went and dumped it into a vineyard and a winery in Argentina. So lived there for about 10 years, building from scratch. Started with raw, virgin land, and built a pretty big project with vineyards and a hotel and spa, wineries. And then since then, I've worked in Hong Kong. I have a little project here in Spain. I live in Barcelona. And I've been sort of going back and forth between technology projects and wine projects ever since. And so when friends of mine who are winemakers started getting proposals from blockchain companies, they started sending them to me. And that's kind of how that's really how I learned about the blockchain in kind of maybe 2019 and really started looking at it. And the more I looked into the technology, the more I understood how it was kind of perfect technology to solve, problems that have been plaguing the wine industry for decades, if not centuries.
That's a really interesting story. Also, your background with technology, then in wine, now back to technology and Web3 crypto, right? What are the main issues that you see that blockchain can solve on the wine industry? And yeah, how do dVIN plans to address those?
Sure. So most industries, if you kind of look at the global economy over the course of the last, let's call it 30, maybe 40 years, since really the internet sort of revolutionized communication and efficiency for everyone, right? What's happened is that most industries have consolidated and become vertically integrated. And you see that in social media, right? Like on Twitter or on Instagram, you'll see these images where there's 8 companies that control the whole food supply, or 5 companies that control all of the banking in the world, or 4 or 5 companies that are all the logistics in the world, and all of that stuff. There's been this consolidation, and one of the big reasons for that consolidation is the internet has created ways of building efficiencies through whether it's faster communication or access to big data, business intelligence, making data-driven decisions. So that has really created the ability and the money for all of these industries to become super consolidated, and that helps them to be a lot more profitable, right? It makes a lot of sense to consolidate or to do a roll up of an industry if you can start sharing data, sharing information, and now be a lot more profitable. Well, the wine industry didn't do that, right? And there's a bunch of reasons, and we can talk about why, but really in the wine industry, you say that there's like 8, maybe 12 companies globally that control 90% of the food we eat. In the wine industry, there are still 30,000 independent winemakers around the world. Independent meaning a family-owned company that makes the wine, right? And there's about 10 million independently owned middlemen. And that makes sense, right? Like when you're going to buy a nice bottle of wine, I'm not talking about like, the $10 Tuesday night bottle that you buy at the grocery store. But if you're buying a $50 bottle of wine, which is an enormous industry, you're typically buying it either at the little wine shop around the corner, right? That's been owned by the same family forever, and they're keeping their inventory on a clipboard. Or you're buying it maybe you're ordering it at a little tiny nice restaurant, right? Again, independently owned, and probably they keep their inventory on like Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheet, right? And what that means is that information just isn't making it back to the winemaker, right? The winemaker doesn't know where their wines are. So let's look at like two sort of interesting comparative industries, right? Look at the global spirits industry. Also, maybe it's smaller than the wine industry. It's about $300 billion a year, but pretty big. But it has been consolidated. There's maybe 8 or 10 companies that own most of the global spirits. So when you buy a bottle of Smirnoff at, at Target or Costco or Walmart, the CMO of Smirnoff knows that you bought that the next day, right? They can see depletion reports. They know, all right, this many bottles were sold in this store, and this many bottles were sold in this store, and this many bottles were sold in that store. And because of that, they're able to do things like use business intelligence for, product development, product mix, how much of each product do they make, supply chain efficiencies, pricing, marketing, messaging, packaging, even advertising. Is my advertising campaign working? I can tell because I know how many bottles were bought, in this region yesterday. But with wine, you have none of that data, right? You don't have any of that data, so you don't really know what the customer is, how the consumers are thinking when you're making the product. And so that makes it an incredibly inefficient business.
Is it like because wine is much hard, not I would say harder to produce, but it's really hard to like industrialize, right? There's like years, seasons, small families keep their business with their land and then the grapes. And if you're doing like vodka, it's much easier to like have like big scale of production. Therefore, you can control things a bit more.
Well, yeah, that's the other thing, right? Like one of the reason that efficiency is so important for the wine industry is if you're Smirnoff and you send 10,000 cases to Brazil and 10,000 cases to South Korea, right? And the South Koreans love it and they drink, all of the Smirnoff, but Brazil, like, maybe they didn't love it. Maybe they something else. Maybe your marketing campaigns didn't work there, right? Well, if you're Smirnoff, you're like, okay, well, I'll just make more Smirnoff and I'll send it to South Korea because like they drank it all. So I'm going to send more there. But if you're a winemaker, first of all, you're not making 1,000,000 cases. You're making like 1,000 cases, maybe. And you're sending like 1,000 to Brazil and 1,000 to South Korea. If South Korea loves your product and they drink it all, you can't make more, right? You can only make it once a year and you can only make a certain amount. Like you can't just buy more grapes, right? Like the grapes that you have are what you have. So, and when you plant a vine, it takes 7 years for it to produce the fruit for you to make good wine in it. So like you're kind of stuck. So it's really important that like if South Korea is drinking twice as much as Brazil, that you send twice as much wine to South Korea than you send to Brazil. But like without data, you don't know. And if you don't know, then it sort of screws up. And so now the South Koreans, they drink all the wine. You can't send any more for another year. they're going to forget about your brand. You're going to have drop-offs, and then like you have to build your business again in South Korea next year. So it's really, again, really inefficient, really difficult.
So that's, I guess, when your project and blockchain takes a very big important step on trying to improve that, right? Can you elaborate a little bit on the vision and or how it works?
Sure. So the first thing that we did, we work mostly with rare investment grade luxury wines. So these are wines that cost like $50 or more. And a lot of these wines have a life in the secondary market, right? Because, unlike Smirnoff, and this is another difference, right? Purchase and consumption with a bottle of Smirnoff is the same, right? When you buy your bottle of Smirnoff, you're probably going to open it and drink it that night or drink part of it that night, right? But if you buy a $50 bottle of wine and take it home, like you might not drink it for 5 years. Like you might lay it down and put it in your collection because it might not be ready to drink, right? Like you might want to age it for 5 or 10 years before you drink it. So like that discrepancy is a big problem. And you might actually, after 5 years, you might sell it to someone else. Like there's a big secondary market for investment grade or luxury wine. Well, right now, a bottle of wine is a possession, right? Like when we talk about RWA, real world assets, the key word there is asset, right? It's an asset. This is a thing that you own. And the difference between an asset and a possession is a deed of ownership, right? Like my car is an asset because if I give you the keys and you drive it away, it's still my car. Like you might be driving it, but I got a piece of paper that says this is my car. If I give you a bottle of wine and you drive away, that bottle of wine is yours, right? Because there's no deed of ownership. I don't have a thing that says that's my bottle. And because of that, there's a bunch of stuff that comes with having a deed of ownership, right? Like tracking, like chain of ownership, chain of custody. There's price transparency. There's, the ability to be able to insure something, right? You can't insure a car unless you own it. There's the ability to borrow against something, right? Like you can't borrow against your car unless you have a deed. Like, so there's all of these things that make it an asset versus a possession. Well, it really wasn't very practical before blockchain to have a deed of ownership for a bottle of wine, right? Like it just wasn't practical. It didn't make sense. How do you have a central registry? Wines are moving over borders. How do you have like, okay, I got my deed of ownership in France, but is that going to work in the United States? Like it didn't make sense. It wasn't practical before blockchain. But what blockchain provides is the ability to have a very cheap, simple, easy to use deed of ownership over an individual bottle of wine that turns that bottle from a possession into an asset. And now that it's an asset, and because it's on chain, every time that bottle is traded, I can see it's like the data's there. I get really good information about like business intelligence over how that bottle makes its way through the supply chain under the consumer. I can track custody. I can track ownership. I get price transparency. Because it's an asset that I own, I can now go out and maybe borrow against it. Again, maybe not for the consumer that has 10 bottles at home, but like if you're a distributor, if you're a retailer, if you're a restaurant, even if you're a winemaker, now you can borrow against it, you can insure it, like all of those things that turn it from being a possession into an asset. So that was the nature of what we did. We created what we call a digital cork, which is a highly customized, very specialized smart contract that serves as a deed of ownership for an individual bottle of wine.
And on the technical side, on the physical side, is it like a QR code? Is it like an NFC that has? I remember seeing something during the event in Singapore that like you could tap your phone and you could see information about that wine, the producer, etc. How does that work?
The position that we've taken is we don't want to pick a winner in that space. There's lots of companies that have developed really cool and really interesting on-bottle tech. Some of them are like these super cool. There's a company called Dust that uses like crushed industrial diamonds to like to show that bottle is unique. There's other companies that do QR codes or NFC or RFID. What we are is the single source of truth. So it doesn't matter what kind of on-bottle tech you have. What we do is we say, okay, we're like two-factor authentication, right? You see what's on the bottle, you see the QR code or the tag or whatever. When you tap that, you go to the digital cork and you can see, okay, I'm going to match up whatever is on that bottle with what's on chain, and now I know if those two things match. Now I know that that bottle is authentic from the winery, and I can claim ownership of it. So we work with right now 5 or 6 different companies that do on bottle tech, and for some wineries they just want a QR code because it's simple, and for some of them they want like a super complicated, very expensive authentication system. For us, it doesn't matter. Like whatever is the unique identifier on the bottle, that we can use to be able to do the 2-factor ID and to show the consumer that it's authentic.
Yeah, you guys are building the underlying infrastructure for this to work, right? Doesn't matter actually necessarily the technology. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I remember, I think last time we spoke, I think it was a few months ago, we're like, okay, this I can clearly understand this RWA angle as well. But there was something that you guys were exploring in terms of the DePIN spaces, like sensors, like if you're moving, thousands and thousands of bottles of wine, you don't want a person to be scanning one by one. How has that evolved?
Really interesting. So about a year ago, I was speaking. So one of our close partners is AWS, actually Amazon Managed Blockchain, which is a unit inside of AWS. And they were presenting us at the London Blockchain Conference as a use case. It was really interesting. And after the show, this guy comes up to me and says, I don't know what you're doing right now, but I need to talk to you right now. And I said, all right. We were actually having a dinner and I invited him to the dinner. We had like 20 people at the dinner and he and I sat in the corner the whole time and talked. And it turns out that this guy was part of the original team out of Cambridge University that developed RFID. And RFID technology has been around for a long time. If you know anything about RFID, it's like, if you go into a shop and there's like a tag, like the anti-theft tag on a like a pair of pants or a t-shirt, and you walk out and you walk through the thing and the alarms go off because they didn't take it off. Like that technology is like 20 years old, and 25, maybe 30 years old. And that's what was developed by these guys and the company is called Redbyte out of Cambridge. More recently, the RFID stuff, especially the anti-theft, like you don't really even see it anymore. Like my grocery store that I go to uses it on cold cuts. So like they make these little packages of like sliced ham and sliced turkey, and like those I like to buy. And so when I buy them and then I'm checking out, they do this thing where they kind of rub it on this thing at the checkout, and then I go and I'm like, and I asked one time, I remember asking this a couple of years ago, I asked them what that was, and they're like, oh, this is RFID, because every individual package of sliced turkey has a special code, like, it's theft protection. So if you tried to leave with this without paying for it, like we would know and the alarms would go off. But more importantly, what it's giving us is business intelligence for like, this turkey was sliced on this day and packaged on this day and purchased on this day. And we're trying to make sure that like the information is going to the people that are slicing the turkey so that like they know how much turkey to slice so that it's always fresh. And like that information, that's super, super interesting, like really great use case. And they boiled it down to where it's just like, it's like this very thin little thing that sits on a, in the package, and super cheap, obviously. Like for a $5 thing of sliced turkey, I'm sure it costs a penny. So that's the kind of technology that they're working on. And what we've been talking to them about, they have completely shifted their business. So Redbyte originally was doing RFID. In the last couple of years, they've completely taken on the idea of DePIN. They're totally focused on using RFID to build DePIN networks. And how we're thinking about it with them is developing RFID readers. They're essentially called an interrogator that could be in every warehouse, every temperature controlled shipping container, every temperature controlled truck, that would log each individual bottle every time it enters or exits one of those locations, and then report the location, GPS location, temperature, and humidity that would be stored, some combination of like IPFS and on chain. Depending, some of it needs to be on chain, some of it just can be like IPFS. But basically, you would have the ability when that bottle gets to the final consumer, they would be able to look at the smart contract for that bottle and be able to see every stop that bottle has made from the winery to your hand, and know that it was stored with the proper temperature and humidity so that bottle is going to be good. And like, that's fantastic, because that in and of itself, that's a $10 billion problem. People pour out every year $10 billion worth of great wine because it was stored incorrectly, and this solves that problem.
I mean, I really like what you guys are doing as well, because everything that you're doing for this can be applied for other like markets as well. Like for example, coffee, right? It was like a RWA use case for the longest time. I haven't seen anyone build something at the level you guys are going for wine. But maybe like the infrastructure, the framework that you're doing can be translated to other things, because it's the same thing, like temperature, quality control over multiple places. Because a lot of the wine out the raw beans comes from outside of the place where people drink the most as well, right? So transporting the green beans, etc.
There's a lot of interesting stuff with coffee. People have talked to me about coffee a little bit. When coffee is one of those things that there was massive consolidation in the coffee industry, obviously, like with big names that everybody knows, for about 20 years. But in the last 10 years, it's gone the other way. This kind of happened in the wine industry maybe 30 years ago, where there was just a lot of cheap wine manufacturers that would buy all the grapes. And then what happened is the grape growers would say, why am I selling my grapes to you when I can just make good wine myself and sell it myself? And so that's kind of what's happened, we think, in the coffee industry, or at least that's what we're hearing, is like a lot of these little growers are like, I'd rather create my own brand, sell my own brand. Now I have the ability to do that. Like, the internet has now given me the ability to create and sell my own brand, and then that's created kind of a really interesting dynamic in the coffee industry, and we think DePIN is a great solution for that.
Yeah, no, I talk about coffee because I used to own a specialty coffee shop here in Portugal, and then I learned about this whole thing. It's like, I mean, espresso is so freaking complicated. Once you start getting to the grams and how everything, there's like a massive chain of processes that needs to go through for you to have your espresso in your cup. That anything goes wrong along the way, it makes a horrible piece of coffee, right? Cup of coffee. So I'm just like connecting the dots there. But going back to the wine part, actually, let's talk a little bit about the token play on that, because I saw that you guys were building on top of Solana. There's the token, which is like the VIN token, right? What are the tokens going to be used for in this ecosystem?
So there's really three important use cases. So first use case is for trading fees. So we're building this year. We'll put about $100 million worth of wine on chain. And then we're working with a bunch of different exchanges and marketplaces to have that wine available for people to be able to trade. So pretty soon, by the end of this quarter, you'll be able to buy tokenized investment grade wine, no matter where you are in the world, that's stored in a bonded warehouse, and like you can buy and sell and trade that wine. Every time you do that, there's a fee that's created, that's generated based on, because we work on Solana, we've worked closely with the Solana Foundation to kind of figure this out. So every time one of those bottles gets traded, there's a small fee that's generated, and then that fee is actually paid in Bitcoin. So what's happening is, no matter where the wine is in the world, no matter who's trading it anywhere, there's a fee that gets generated. That fee is in Bitcoin. And so that's the first and foremost, is to pay fees to us, to the winery, and to the outlet. And then we actually have a buyback and burn thing that we're working on with that. So like every time a fee is generated, not only we'll be buying Bitcoin with that, and then there's a portion of it that'll get burned. So that's creating kind of a deflationary pressure there. The second use case, which I think is the most important, and certainly the most important for this for your listeners, is in the DePIN. So the device, or the ecosystem that we're building with Redbyte, has kind of two components, right? Like there's obviously RFID sticker on every bottle. There's an RFID interrogator. But because there are 10 million different middlemen in the wine business, as we were saying earlier, it's not possible to create a centralized network that'll track every bottle. You need to, instead of trying to do it top down, we're using, DePIN technology to build it from the ground up, right? So, providing incentives for all of these warehouse owners, all of the trucks, all of the shipping containers, all of the retailers and restaurants, providing them with the ability to, they buy a very simple, cheap device. They set up that device, and then that device records every time a bottle goes in or out. And every time that recording happens, or every time that data is updated, whoever owns the interrogator gets paid a little bit of VIN, right? So VIN gets attached to the bottle, and they get paid VIN. Now, probably what happens is they get paid USD, right? Like they'll get paid in dollars, or they'll get paid in some kind of fiat currency because it's going to be in the network. But the underlying token that runs the entire DePIN is VIN.
I think that's the only way that you guys are going to be able to really expand, right? Is in the DePIN model, because everyone's going to have an incentive to actually install this device on their warehouse, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to convince people to actually do the work, right?
It's an incentive in the beginning, and then over time, it starts to be a lot of pressure, right? Like once you get to a tipping point, and there's a critical mass of, these middlemen that are using the DePIN. Like imagine at some point, like you get a delivery of a bottle, and it's not in the system. Like there's gaps in the chain of custody, and you're like, oh, I'm actually I want to pay less for this bottle than I would for a bottle that has perfect provenance. So now what'll happen is all the way up the chain, the retailer will be like, I'm only going to buy wine from people that are on the DePIN, and that'll keep going all the way up the chain. So what you'll find is that once you get to a critical mass, and once people get used to saying, all right, if I scan this bottle, I'm 100% sure that it's perfect. If I can't scan the bottle, I don't know. They're always going to want the more secure option.
Yeah, you're gonna be a bit sketched out of wines that don't have. Is it a counterfeit wine? Is it real?
Yeah, right.
Right. So I think it's gonna create a really good pro customer as well, right? They know what they're
Super
getting.
pro customer. Yeah.
How big is like the fake wine market out there? Is there something? I have no idea.
The wine market is impossibly big. Like you can't imagine how big it is. Most people, when they guess, they think that it's about 10% of the size that it actually is. So I'll throw out just a couple of numbers. So in 2023, the global turnover in the wine industry was $485 billion. It's a big number. What does that mean, right? So you take that number, and if you wanted to put it in perspective, you could take, like, let's just look at discretionary spending, right? $50 bottle of like wine, like something else that would be discretionary. So let's say movies, right? Film. So if you take the entire global film industry, and then you add the entire global television industry, and then you add the entire global publishing industry, and the entire global music industry, and the entire global video game industry, all of that together, it's still smaller than the wine industry. That's how big it is. So huge business all over the world. And when you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like, the music industry, if you're a music fan, you pay $12 a month. And if you're not, you get it for free, right? If you're a video game person, like, maybe you're spending $50 a month. Maybe you're spending $50 a month on TV. Maybe you go to 2 movies a year, or 2 movies, maybe a movie a month, maybe 2. But like all of that together is like 2 bottles of wine, right? Maybe 3 bottles of wine. So like it ends up being, you're just spending more on wine, and it's just a bigger, like, especially wine people are spending a lot more on wine. So it's a really big industry. It's really, obviously, we've talked about how atomized it is. And there's something kind of interesting about it, which is when you walk into a wine shop, you look at 500 bottles on the shelves, and they're all the same shape. They're all the same size. They're all the same color. There's a little bit of difference on the little piece of paper on the front, but other than that, they all kind of look the same. And so the only thing that distinguishes a $5 bottle of wine and a $50 bottle of wine is the brand, right? Is that little piece of paper on the front. And so what's happened is that little piece of paper on the front is pretty easy to counterfeit. There are whole movies about that. There's a great movie called Sour Grapes with one guy that that did about $80 million worth of counterfeit wine. Sold $80 million worth of counterfeit wine. One guy. They think that it's probably somewhere between a $50 and $70 billion a year problem. The thing that I always talk about, two really big things that are kind of interesting stories that both get solved with blockchain. One of them is Penfolds, which is a big wine company in Australia. They make some of the best wine in the world. They sell to, they used to, and they still do, sell a lot of wine to China. Well, somebody in China figured out how to counterfeit their wines. And, they make expensive wines that sell for $50 or $75 a bottle. And someone in China was able to replicate that for $2. And they were indistinguishable from one another. And there was a time when Penfolds they'd started researching this, where they were pretty sure that there was more counterfeit Penfolds in China than there was real Penfolds in the entire world. So, that's a huge problem, right? It totally bit into their profit margins. It was a big IP issue. It actually was a big issue between the Australian government and the Chinese government. So, that's a problem. Gets solved kind of instantly with blockchain. But actually, the biggest counterfeit issue, or the biggest kind of wine fraud incident that's happened in 20 years, is a winemaker in Bordeaux who, over the course of years and years and years, was counterfeiting his own wine. And that sounds crazy, right? How could he counterfeit his own wine? Why would he do that? Well, so in Bordeaux and in most places of the world that make great wine, there's a lot of regulations about how many grapes you can have and how much wine you can make, right? And if you want to call your wine a Bordeaux wine, or a Saint-Emilion wine, or a Pomerol wine, which are kind of the little mini regions inside of Bordeaux, all the grapes have to come from that region. They've got to be grown in that region. And there's only a certain amount of land there, and there's only a certain amount of grapes. So what happened is this guy was buying grapes from somewhere else in France, having them delivered to his winery, in the dark of night, and then making wine that wasn't really Bordeaux, but he put his Bordeaux label on it. And so he was selling cheap, basically counterfeit grapes as his wine. And so how do you solve that problem? Well, it's actually pretty easy. The reason that he was able to get away with that is because he was selling 50,000 cases when, realistically, he could only make 10,000 cases on his property. Well, with blockchain, that's all transparent, right? And you would know how many cases of that wine existed in the world. Well, that kind of transparency would solve that problem. And again, these are all weird little problems in a very big industry, but all of those problems get solved with blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very nice story as well, right? And you can clearly see how that's gonna really solve a big problem. What are the milestones that you guys managed to reach so far, and how do you see the project going? The next 5 years, 10 years, etc.
Well, so we started in 2021. The first thing that we did was we created a sandbox. We call it Club dVIN, which is basically a little group of. It started off with all friends and winemakers, and now we have a couple thousand people that are members of Club dVIN. They the deal with them is they get access to wine and experiences and stuff before anybody else. And they have, in exchange for that, they have to put up with buggy software. So that was the first 2 years, and we did a lot of trial and error. We did pilots with 70 different winemakers. We put wine on the platform. We tokenized wine, put it on the platform. We've had to tear it down and build it up, and tear it down and build it up many times since then. Last year, we had two big milestones. One of them was we tore down our software and we built it all up from scratch. We built the protocol on Solana. We tinkered around in the beginning with at first on Ethereum mainnet, then we did Polygon. We've done some stuff on Base, we've done some stuff on a couple of other platforms, but Solana really kind of came through. We did a partnership with Solana. We got a grant from Solana. Solana's been a really fantastic partner. So that was one big milestone, and we did the big product launch at Breakpoint. The other thing we did is launched our token. So the dVIN coin also was launched late last year. We're actually in the process of doing a big relaunch of it, which is really exciting. We've got a bunch of cool stuff that we're doing. And then at the end of last year, we launched our AI platform, which is it's very cool. It's an AI platform. You can actually find it on Twitter or on Telegram that has basically all of the knowledge about wine in the world, and you can get everything from tasting notes or food pairing suggestions or wine education to actually wine trading information. You can find out like what kinds of wine should I buy as an investment and get good investment advice. That's really exciting. So we launched late last year. This year, the milestones for 2025 are by the end of the year, we'll have tokenized about $100 million worth of wine. So far to date, I think we've tokenized 3.5 million. So like we're 30xing that this year. And then we're launching with partners at least 6 marketplaces this year. So, one central order book for $100 million worth of wine, and then different places where you'll be able to access and trade those bottles. So we're super excited about that. And that's what 2025 looks like for us.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I like to see where you guys are heading, because it's definitely a problem that needs to be solved. I really like wine. Like in Portugal and Spain, you have great wines, and I definitely don't want to be buying like counterfeit wine if I don't. So I can't wait to start like going to the store and looking at all the wines, and then even getting more and more Portuguese producers to also use the technology and get into the Web3. Where can people know more about the project, contact you guys, and be up to date with all the updates?
We're dVIN Labs on dVIN Labs on X or even on Instagram. I also think on Telegram, we're at dVIN Labs on Telegram. You go to our website, dvinlabs.com. Those are kind of the main places. But we also, once you go there, you'll see we do events all over the world. We just got back from doing a really cool event in Miami. We're doing an event in, I think in London in a couple of weeks. We're doing an event in Santa Barbara. Next month, we're doing something in Dubai for Token. So lots of fun events coming. You can kind of check us out there. You can check out clubdvin.com if you're interested in being a guinea pig. But we got a bunch of guinea pigs. We actually keep our membership pretty tight. But if you're interested, there's an application there where you can join.
Amazing. Also, go to dpinhub.io and check the project now on the platform. We're going to be adding this podcast there. Whatever you're listening, if you're on YouTube or Spotify, make sure to follow this episode and more, because we have a lot of new founders of different angles, because this one is a little bit more RWA, but with like a touch of DePIN, something that really, really excites me. Well, thanks so much for joining today. It was very interesting to see you, and hope to talk to you in Token 2049 in other places around the world, maybe in a year or so. We can have another podcast episode to see all the progress that has been done. I think it's going to be awesome.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great one. Bye-bye.